All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tom Borashevich. I'm with the library. We've got this evening Pat Wild, the town historian. He's going to talk to us about Bethel, its role in the Revolutionary War. And I just want to remind you that this is our second to last of our America 250 programs. Our last one is on June 29th, and that will be the New England Pirates during the Revolution. Prior to that, I hope you all get an opportunity to attend the town celebration on June 13th. That'll be Saturday, 2 weeks from now. There's going to be a great display out on the front lawn of the Municipal Center, and the library will be doing patriotic tie-dye, red, white, and blue tote bags to the first 250 people who attend. So with that, one final thing. We have Alice Hutchinson from Bird's Books today. She's got copies of all of Pat's books. They will be available for purchase after the program. So if you don't already own one, I'd suggest getting one. And you might be lucky enough to get Pat's signature. So, Pat, please.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for showing up tonight. I appreciate you being here. I'm going to move along quickly because I know I have the tendency to drone on, and I don't want to keep the library employees here beyond the point where they're not getting paid. So I hope they're going to enjoy it. My view has always been that history is supposed to be fun and not boring. Some of my students didn't always agree, but I'm hoping you'll have a good time. Now, thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Let's get started right off the bat. I want to just lay out for you the format of the program outline. 5 parts to it. Some are very brief, some are a little bit longer. We're going to look at the basic facts about the American Revolution. We're going to take a look at some revolutionary luminaries, meaning some important people who actually were in Bethel during the American Revolution. Then we're going to talk about some of our own local heroes, Bethel people who participated in the Revolution. We're going to look at some loyalists in our midst. Loyalists are a topic that aren't always discussed. We're going to make sure that they are. And then part 5 is a brief little closing that I like to call Freedom Isn't Free.
Show people on there.
Now, because some people have been out of high school for quite some time, I just want to review some of the basic facts, brushing up on the essentials of the American Revolution. Now, up at the top, the war begins with the Battle of Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts on April 19th, 1775. That is seen as the official start of the war. Not too long afterwards, on June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill takes place. The British drive the Americans from Breed's Hill in a costly battle outside of Boston. July 4th, 1776. That's what this 250 celebration is all about. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of that event. The 13 colonies officially declare their independence from Britain. In September, the British forces occupy New York City. They will hold that important city and port for the entire war. April 26, 1777, a local event. British troops conduct a raid on Danbury, Connecticut.
PowerPoint.
On October 17th, 1777, the British are defeated at the Battle of Saratoga in New York. This battle is seen as the turning point of the war, leading the French to intervene on our side. December 1777 to June 1778, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, serves as the encampment for George Washington's troops during an extremely harsh winter. Unfortunately for the people fighting on both sides, some of the harshest winters of the entire century took place during the American Revolution, and there were 3 right in a row. September 24th, 1780, Benedict Arnold is exposed as a traitor. On October 19th, 1781, British forces under Cornwallis are defeated at Yorktown, Virginia, marking the last major conflict of the war. Takes a while for the British to accept the fact that they've lost. So the last big battle is 1781. Almost 2 years later, we get them to sit down and to sign a treaty, and the Treaty of Paris is signed officially, ending the war. Now, on the local level, when we take a look at Bethel, so you'll understand where we were in terms of this conflict, the area that we know as Bethel today was first settled around 1700. Settlers from Norwalk had walked up to what is now Danbury as early as 1684. By the time settlement spread out into what is now Bethel, it was about 1700, with the earliest houses lying in the area known as Grassy Plain. 1759, Bethel was set off as the second ecclesiastical society of Danbury by the Connecticut Colonial Assembly. So we're not a separate town, but we are a separate parish from the first ecclesiastical society of Danbury. That's the Congregational Church. In 1760, the first church was built at the intersection of Main Street, Chestnut Street, and Maple Avenue, precisely where the Congregational Church is today. In 1774, a census of Danbury showed a population of 2,576 residents, of which approximately 800 lived in what is now the town of Bethel. From 1775 to 1783, at least 42 citizens of Bethel served in the American Revolution. 34 are known to have graves in the old burying ground on Main Street. Most people call it the Congregational Church Cemetery. I like to call it its original name, the Old Burying Ground. Finally, in 1855, long after this war, Bethel was incorporated as a town by the Connecticut State Legislature. And when they take the first U.S. census with Bethel as a town, they find that our population at that point was 1,711. In the last census, we have now surpassed 20,000 people. All right, let's take a look at the spirit of the times. When this revolution begins, some people are in favor of it, some people aren't. If you were in favor of it, or if your community was, one of the things they might do is raise a liberty pole. And here we see an idealized view of the liberty pole being raised in New England in 1875. It was a way for a community to show its support for the cause of American independence. In the background, I don't know if you can see it, another thing that's going on is the owner of a tavern is taking down the tavern sign because it had an image of King George III on it. And that was now out of fashion. Now, here in Bethel, we had our own liberty pole. And you can see it right here. And it was topped with both a liberty cap and an eagle, as seen in this illustration that was created in 1834. Liberty caps were a symbol dating back to ancient Rome. Slaves who were granted their freedom were given bright red caps so they would not be mistaken for runaways. And I show you a color example in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, if you're trying to figure out where this image is, I know a lot of you have seen this image before, but it's always a little bit of a challenge to figure out what it's trying to show. You're standing in the middle of Chestnut Street and you're looking north. Main Street turns to the left, Maple Avenue turns to the right and goes downhill. The church you see was the very first Congregational church. There have been three. This one was completed in 1760. The second one was completed in 1843. The current one was built in 1867. That building burned in 1842, so it's no longer around. However, the houses that I've labeled for you, 4 Maple Avenue, 2 Chestnut Street, and 4 Chestnut Street are all still standing. So it's kind of amazing that they have survived for this length of time. But this was a gathering spot for people during the Revolution. Later on, the militia trained in this little area. That was kind of Bethel's town green. This house that you see on on the left, burned in 1900. That was the home of Phineas Taylor, the grandfather of P.T. Barnum. All right, the P.T. stood for Phineas Taylor Barnum. He was named for his grandfather. He lived right there. So anyway, that's what Bethel would have looked like in colonial times and afterwards. Now we're going to move on to what I'd like to call revolutionary luminaries. These are famous figures who passed through Bethel. The people you see in this painting are all from Danbury. They were painted by a primitive artist called John Brewster in 1799. But I really think those are two beautiful portraits that were meant to hang side by side. All right, the first luminary we're going to talk about is General William Tryon. This British general, or major general, and 39th British colonial governor of New York passed through Bethel when he led a force of approximately 1,800 British troops from New York City to destroy American supplies stored in Danbury. 19 houses and 22 storehouses were burned during the attack. Tryon's troops were pursued by an American force of roughly 500 to 700 soldiers, with whom they would clash at the Battle of Ridgefield on April 27, 1777. The previous year, Tryon had taken part in a bungled plot to kidnap George Washington. All right, so if anybody wants to boo and hiss, this is the time to do it now. Trying to capture George Washington. All right, Tryon's troops sailed from New York City and landed at Campo Beach in what is now Westport on April 25th, 1777. They encamped that night in present-day Weston. The next morning, they continued their 26-mile march to Danbury. So when I say 26 miles, that's just from the coast to Danbury. And then afterwards, they had to march back again. So these people did some serious traveling by foot. Now, when they came through Bethel, what way did they go? I've mapped it out for you. General Tryon's British troops marched north from their ships in Westport, through Weston and Reading, and entered Bethel by way of Sunset Hill Road. They then proceeded along today's Putnam Park Road, or Route 58, to the eastern foot of Hoyt's Hill. They next marched over Hoyt's Hill to present-day Upper Greenwood Avenue, and that's kind of where this map picks up. So here's Hoyt's Hill. Then this portion of Greenwood Avenue, when this map was made in 1893, was called Elm Street, but today it's all Greenwood Avenue. They came to this point and they turned right onto Chestnut Street. And you might say, well, why didn't they go through here? It wasn't created until 1831. This part of Greenwood Avenue came later. So they had to go over to Chestnut Street, Main Street, through what is now P.T. Barnum Square, back onto Greenwood Avenue, all the way down to basically where the Sycamore Restaurant is right here, and then onto Grassy Plain Street. Then they went down to Mansfield Street, took a left, brought them out to Coal Pit Hill Road, and they traveled up Coal Pit Hill to South Street in Danbury. So when they arrived in Danbury, when they entered downtown Danbury, they came by way of Coal Pit Hill. Now, Tryon's raid is shown here in a 1976 illustration. Again, some of us can remember the bicentennial. Hard to believe that was 50 years ago. In the raid, British troops destroyed 4,000 to 5,000 barrels of pork, beef, and flour, 5,000 pairs of shoes, 2,000 bushels of grain, and 1,600 tents, among other supplies. This image is supposed to show South Street. This building up with the top with the arrow. Today, Danbury South Street School is located on that very same spot. That was the Church of England. That was not harmed in any way. There were supplies stored in the church, but they were taken out into the street and destroyed. The building, because it was the Church of England and King George III was the official head of the Church of England, it was left standing. But I was reading just yesterday about all of the stuff that was destroyed. In George Washington's estimation, the thing that was the most costly for the Americans were the tents. 1,600 tents. America did not have the ability to produce its own tents at that point in time, and they had to be imported from France. So when they were destroyed, that meant it's going to be a long time before we had any replacements.
Would this also, the fire that destroyed our records, Danbury's old records?
That's coming up.
Oh, sorry.
That's coming up. No, you're absolutely right. It is. It is. And I gave you some specifics when we move along here. General David Worcester was in charge of the Americans who were trailing the British and were trying to catch up with them. American General David Worcester spent the night of April 26, 1777 in Bethel, which would be his last night of good health. He led a group of approximately 600 American militiamen who had marched from New Haven and Fairfield, arriving in Bethel sometime between 11:30 p.m. and midnight after trudging through heavy rain. The following day, Worcester was wounded in the Battle of Ridgefield and would later die from his injuries on May 2nd, 1777 in Danbury. He was 66 years old at the time of his death. And this image, which you always see, no matter where you go to look up information about David Worcester, this is a conjectural image. No true likeness of him is known to exist. So unfortunately, we don't know what he really looked like. Now, this is how he met his sad end. When Worcester and his men caught up with the British, they were a little tentative about engaging them. Some of these Americans had never been in a battle before, and Worcester was trying to spur them on. He's on horseback. He's a much bigger target. He shouts out, "Come on, my boys, never mind such random shots." In other words, he's trying to say these guys could never hit the broadside of a barn. Just as the words leave his mouth, he is struck by a bullet. Now, some accounts say that he was struck in the back, but I think the true story was he was struck in the groin, and then the bullet continued on and hit the bottom of his spinal cord. And he was immediately paralyzed from the neck down and fell from his horse and was caught by some of his men. This all happened on North Salem Road in Ridgefield, or Route 116. It's kind of, the location is just down the road from Ridgefield High School, if you know where that is located. I used to drive by it on a regular basis when I taught at Ridgefield High. Now, here's another luminary who took part in the attempt to chase the British from Connecticut, General Silliman. General Silliman was the third American general to spend the night of April 26, 1777. You'll see who the other one was in just a minute. He was only 44 years old at the time of the Danbury raid. He would survive the Battle of Ridgefield the following day, but later in the war, he was kidnapped by loyalists. On May 2nd, 1779, Silliman, along with his son Billy, was abducted and taken to the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, which was then under British control. He was held for 7 months until exchanged for a British officer the Patriots had specifically captured to obtain Silliman's release. They used to do this all the time. The British had control, for the most part, of Long Island. And what they would do is they would come across Long Island Sound and they would try to kidnap some prominent American and take them back to New York City. And the Americans would basically say, "Oh, you're going to play that way, huh?" And they would get in a boat and they would go across on a dark night and capture one of their military leaders. And then at some point, an exchange would be arranged. But there was a constant back and forth between the two sides. All right, here's the most famous individual who was here in Bethel the night before the Battle of Ridgefield, General Benedict Arnold. Arnold was just 36 years old at the time, and he also spent the rainy night of April 26, 1777 in Bethel. Here, he and his fellow officers plotted a strategy on how best to engage the British, who were then quartered in Danbury. Their original plan was to wait for the British to return along the same route they had taken on their arrival. Unfortunately for the Americans, the British were informed of this by local Tories and decided to use a western route to avoid an encounter with Patriot forces. Benedict Arnold, whose name is now synonymous with the word traitor, would become the hero of the Battle of Ridgefield on April 27th, and also the Battle of Saratoga in September and October later that same year. His perceived lack of recognition for his accomplishments drove him to join the British in September of 1780. And I was reading in preparation for this presentation British General Tryon's explanation for why he did not want to return the same way he had come in. And he said right out, "I did not want to encounter Mr. Arnold." He knew that Arnold had a reputation for being a good military leader and a fierce fighter. And they said, all right, let's go out the back door so we can avoid Benedict Arnold. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this part, because this is something that hardly anybody knows, and you're going to be in the know, all right? You're going to be in on it. Before there was a Battle of Ridgefield, there might have actually been a Battle of Bethel, but it was circumvented. Now, here's the story. At 10 a.m. on Sunday, April 27th, 1777, Benedict Arnold wrote a message. Now, again, this is Benedict Arnold. This guy is big. This is not some local yokel. He writes, at 6 this morning, we divided the troops into 2 divisions, being uncertain if they, meaning the British, would return by way of Fairfield or Norwalk. One division was stationed on each road on a crossroad where they could support each other. Now, you might say, what the heck is he talking about? Arnold was describing today's Griswold Street, which is 1.7 miles or a 38-minute walk from Danbury's South Street, where the British began burning storehouses during the night. The Americans remained here until 10 a.m. when they learned that the British had left Danbury sometime after 7 a.m. via Worcester Street and were heading west. Now, if you look at my map, you'll see this is the point where Greenwood Avenue meets Grassy Plain Street. What I tried to illustrate here is this is the ancient sycamore tree that stands at the corner, which some people believe is over 400 years old. They were right behind that area on Griswold Street. And they said, we're going to hide here until the British return. Now, we don't know which road they're going to take. They could try to slip down Grassy Plain or Route 53 and go to Norwalk, or they could go back the way they came in on what was then called the Fairfield Road. So they divided their forces, and it seems that Worcester and approximately 200 men were on Greenwood Avenue, and Arnold and Silliman, with approximately 400 men, were on Grassy Plain Street. And they basically said, the minute we see which way the British turn at this point, we will combine our forces and we'll just pop up out of nowhere and surprise them. Now, I want to show you specifics. This is Griswold Street today. You're going to have to use your imagination. It looks a little different than it did in 1777. This is where the American generals, Worcester, Arnold, and Silliman, along with 600 soldiers, waited for the British from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Sunday, April 27, 1777. The elevation of the location, combined with the absence of trees and buildings at the time, would have enabled the Americans to see the returning British forces as soon as they reached the eastern end of today's Mansfield Street, located half a mile to the north. So if you go to Griswold Street today and you go to the very top of the hill, the crest of the hill, the center photograph is what you will see. And what I was trying to show, this is the natural lay of the land. None of this was here. The only thing that might have been there, this is the top of the ancient sycamore at the corner of Greenwood Avenue and Grassy Plain Street. It was probably much smaller in 1777, but you had a commanding view. The men probably hid here. They probably crouched down or were lying on their stomachs. And if the British returned the way they had come in on Greenwood Avenue, the Americans could drop out of nowhere and attack them. If they decided to go along the Norwalk Road or Route 53, Grassy Plain Street, they could do the same in the opposite direction. So this sounds like an excellent spot to try and stop the British. All right, they had the element of surprise if they hid themselves well enough and nobody spilled the beans of where they were. However, they still would have been outnumbered 3-1. So even if the British had gone back the way they had come in, the Americans would have had a tough time in defeating them. Now, you might be skeptical. You might say, how do we know that Griswold Street existed in 1777? So bear with me. This will tell you a little bit about what you were talking about in terms of the records being burned. During the British raid on Danbury, the last building, this always gets me, the very last building burned was the home of the town clerk, Major Taylor. And that was his first name, Major. That wasn't his military rank, all right? And he lived on what is now Mountainville Avenue. Unfortunately, Taylor had stored the town's land records in his house and did not take them with him when he evacuated. As a result, the records of all land transactions in Danbury and Bethel, dating back to 1684, including the original purchases made from the indigenous people, were lost. All right. So that is something that still affects us to this very day. In other words, other towns, they have the documents that were signed by the indigenous people, granting parcels of land. Newtown has that, Ridgefield has that. Danbury, Bethel, we have nothing. It all went up in flames in 1777. Additionally, the descriptions and locations of all town-owned roads were also destroyed. In May 1777, the Danbury Board of Selectmen requested that the Connecticut General Assembly appoint a committee to oversee the re-recording of land records and to conduct proper surveys of all highways. This request was approved in January 1778. The appointed committee completed and submitted the highway survey on March 23rd, 1778. In this survey, highway number 90 describes today's Griswold Street. Also, we laid out a highway from the Fairfield Road to the Norwalk Road across the hill near Deacon Stephen Trowbridge's house, said highway to be 3 rods wide, which was 49.5 feet. Now, again, if you don't believe me, all you have to do is go to the Danbury City Hall and find the town records from this time period. And on page 207, what you will find is up there in the original handwriting. This is a copy of an original document done at the time period. And down the bottom is a transcription. And notice, not only does it say the Fairfield Road and the Norwalk Road, it says across the hill near Deacon Stephen Trowbridge's house. Well, that house, luckily for all of us, still survives at 63 Grassy Plain Street. And it is located close to the western end of Griswold Street. So it all checks out. Another historic house that played a role in the events of the Revolution was the Captain Daniel Hickok House, which formerly stood at 13 Blackman Avenue. Now, this is oral tradition. You know, people say oral history isn't worth the paper it's written on, meaning you can't trust it. But this, to me, even though we can't prove it, it does seem to make sense. All right, just bear with me. Tradition relates that Generals Arnold, Worcester, and Silliman spent the night of April 26, 1777, in this house. Records show that the home's owner, Daniel Hickok, had previously served under Worcester's command, but was not enlisted at this time. In other words, during the Revolution, you could sign up for what they call levies, short levies. You could do a 3-month sign up. You could do a 6 month sign up. It's almost like signing on with a cell phone company today. But you didn't have to commit yourself for a long period of time. So Hickok had served under Worcester. He was not officially in service at the time. But it seems logical that these 3 high-ranking officers would seek the advice and hospitality of a militia captain who was well acquainted with the local area and its inhabitants. Now, this always makes me sad. Sadly, the Daniel Hickok House, a salt box style home, which may have dated to as early as the 1740s, was destroyed by fire on December 22nd, 2014, and its charred remains were demolished in September 2018. So it's just a vacant lot now. But again, some pretty heavy hitters may have spent the night there. They didn't get a lot of time to sleep because the Americans arrived in Bethel between 11:30 and midnight, and Arnold said they were on Griswold Street by 6 a.m. So they didn't do a lot of sleeping, but you wonder where all these Americans slept. I think a lot of barns were probably used because we didn't have a Hilton or a Marriott at the time. All right, another person we should be familiar with in our part of Connecticut, General Israel Putnam. He was a resident of Brooklyn, Connecticut, and he was a hardened veteran of the French and Indian War. Putnam and 3 brigades of troops spent the severe winter of 1778 to 1779 encamped along the Reading-Bethel border. The site of their camp is today preserved within the boundaries of Putnam State Park. Putnam is remembered most for the famous quote, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes," which he is said to have uttered at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Less than 9 months after leaving the Reading-Bethel winter encampment, Putnam suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed and brought his military service to an end. And I know I'm trying to move us along, but I want to share one thing. I don't know how many of you got a chance to see Ken Burns' documentary series on the American Revolution. I was very interested to note that they never attributed that quote to Israel Putnam in that series. They talked about, the Battle of Breed's Hill, or the name that most people are familiar with, the Battle of Bunker Hill. They never did that. And I guess they felt, well, there's not enough documentation. That is a quote that was attributed to him long after the battle ended. So it's a shame because that's what he's famous for. And now if they take that away, he doesn't have as much to make him familiar to people. But again, we want to strive for accuracy too.
How many men were in the brigade?
1,000, I think. Right. Yeah. If I'm getting my numbers right. Anybody here who's more knowledgeable, please, you can correct me. All right, here is Putnam again. And this is a 1976 illustration. And it shows Putnam's encampment. He had approximately 3,000 soldiers of the Continental Army encamped in what we know now as Putnam State Park. There's one inaccuracy in this drawing, and I didn't know about this until I read up on it a little bit more. In the drawing, you see that the hut in which the soldiers stayed has a chimney that's made of logs. Dan Cruzon, who unfortunately has passed away, who was the town historian for Newtown and did a lot of research about Putnam Park, did archaeological digs. In his book that he produced about the encampment, he said that the chimneys were made of stone rather than logs. And when you go through the historic side of the park and you walk down the dirt road, you'll see these piles of stones in a row. A lot of people think, oh, that's the remains of their campfires. No, when the soldiers left this encampment, they burned the huts. And when the huts burned, the chimneys then collapsed and they created those piles. And they've kind of been neatened up over the years in creating the park. But that's the one inaccuracy in this illustration. All right. People are probably familiar with this as well. This is a large statue of Putnam that stands at the entrance of Putnam State Park. And it was created by the noted artist and Reading resident Anna Hyatt Huntington, the same sculptress who created the statue of Abraham Lincoln that stands in the courtyard of the Bethel Public Library, just a short distance from where we're sitting right now. But it's a great statue that really captures the defiance of Putnam when he was being chased by British troops. All right, here's a person a lot of people don't know about, but probably really should. Brigadier General Enoch Poor. Poor was a veteran of the battles of Trenton, Princeton, Saratoga, Monmouth, and was with Washington at Valley Forge. A brigade of his New Hampshire troops, approximately 1,000 soldiers, you're asking me about a brigade, was encamped near the intersection of Old Hollyville Road and Plumtrees Road from December 1779 until April of 1780. Poor spent the previous winter with Israel Putnam's camp on the Bethel-Reading border. When he died, reportedly in a duel, less than 5 months after leaving Bethel, his funeral was attended by both Washington and Lafayette. This guy had 3 rough winters. I was telling you about how bad the winters were during the Revolution. He's with Washington in Valley Forge, then he's with Putnam on the Bethel-Reading border, and then the next winter he's here in Bethel. And I'll show you where he stayed. The site of Poor's encampment is now occupied by present-day Vining Road and the southern half of Blue Jay Orchards. Old land records describe property on the western side of this portion of Old Hollyville Road as being situated at the old hut lot, so called. The hut lot was the local name given to the area where soldiers built their winter shelter. And that's a homemade map that I made. And if you want to see a little more professional one, I'm trying to show you Poor's encampment, showing you Vining Road, the 4-way intersection of Plumtrees Road and Old Hollyville. You see the location of the Blue Jay Orchard store. It was a big area. And again, these New Hampshire troops spent a rough winter there. But hopefully now you can identify where it is. And again, when they created Vining Road in 1961, they probably destroyed any archaeological evidence. I mean, I don't know if anybody lives on Vining Road or has friends on Vining Road, but if you ever feel like having some fun with a metal detector, it would be interesting to see if there's anything we could find there. All right. We know some facts about the camp through the diary of a New Hampshire soldier named Major David Livermore. This is a transcription of the diary that he kept. And you see they arrived in what is now Blue Jay Orchards on Thursday, December 2nd, 1779. This day, the troops proceed on the march and go on the ground laid out for hutting, which is in the vicinity of Danbury towards Newton, meaning Newtown. Friday, December 3rd, Saturday the 4th, and Sunday the 5th. These 3 days, the troops are busy in clearing and fixing for laying the foundation of the huts. So again, here's somebody who was there and who lived it. However, David Livermore let us down because he recorded what was going on when they arrived in camp. And then he didn't make another diary entry until they left the camp. All right, his last entry was Tuesday, December 7th. He picks up again the following April. And he says, after spending a very disagreeable winter in the outskirts of Danbury, bordering again on Newton, at a place called Wildcat, and Wildcat was the name of Bethel School District for that part of town. The circumstances have prevented me from keeping a minute of this. This day, General Poor's brigade leave the winter quarters and march for West Point on the North River. So unfortunately, he left and it didn't give us all the details. However, we have another account by somebody who lived in the area, a man by the name of Benjamin Hoyt, who lived on Old Hollyville Road. He gave us some details that Livermore left out. Now, here's another big time figure from the American Revolution. His name was Major General Horatio Gates. Gates encamped with 3 to 4 brigades of the Continental Army atop Shelter Rock Hill at the Crow's Nest in Danbury from September 19th to October 19th, 1778. He stationed pickets or lookouts along Walnut Hill Road and Main Street in Bethel. Gates was sometimes viewed as a potential replacement for Washington during the times when the war was not going well for the American forces. He and Washington did not get along. When he won the Battle of Saratoga with the great help of Benedict Arnold, he was supposed to report directly to Washington, tell him what happened, and then have Washington share the news with the Continental Congress. What did he do? He bypassed Washington entirely and wrote directly to the Continental Congress himself. He was not following the chain of command. You can imagine how George Washington felt about that. All right, he was not a happy camper. Two little side facts. The site of the encampment is still known as Crow's Nest today. So you can drive up to the top of Shelter Rock Hill and you will see the street sign that says Crow's Nest. And when Bethel was set off from Danbury in 1855, the new town boundaries still referred to the land near Shelter Rock Hill as the Army ground. So in other words, people still remembered, hey, that's where the Army stayed during the Revolution, right along the Bethel-Danbury border. All right, the man himself, General George Washington, who was called the indispensable man, the one person we could not do without during the Revolution. He passed through Bethel on September 20th, 1780, on his way from his headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey, to an important meeting with the French general, Count Rochambeau, in Hartford. His route took him from a tavern in the Ridgebury section of Ridgefield along George Washington Highway, and that's why that road is called George Washington Highway, because he traveled along it, across the border from Ridgefield into Danbury, then onto Myrie Road, Worcester Heights, Worcester Street, Main Street, South Street, these are all in Danbury, over Shelter Rock Hill, onto Old Turnpike Road in Bethel, Walnut Hill Road, and then to Old Bethel Road in Newtown. From there, he turned north on today's Route 25 and went up Wisconsin Hill into Brookfield. Now, take a look at this. This corner here is McCollar Park, which anybody from Bethel is familiar with. On September 20th, 1780, General George Washington's journey to Hartford would have taken him from Danbury over Shelter Rock Hill, where we would have passed into what is now Bethel, and through the intersection of Shelter Rock Road, Payne Road, and a portion of Old Turnpike Road. And that's right here where this white arrow begins. Old Turnpike Road used to go up the hill. Now it's gone. That portion of the road was abandoned way back in 1956. This was then the main route between Hartford and Danbury and was known as the Middle Road. So I know I'm a history nerd, but I can't help it. Every time I drive by this spot, I picture George Washington on horseback going up that hill. It continues to blow my mind. And here's another depiction of the route that he took. This is the portion of Old Turnpike Road that no longer exists, but you can see it would have been a straight shot onto Walnut Hill Road, and you continued on to the portion where Bethel meets Newtown. That's this dotted line right here, and the road changes its name to Old Bethel Road once you cross into the Newtown side. Now, just above it, you see Route 6, and you might say, well, why didn't they take that route? It wasn't there. And this took me years to find. And I only found it, I'm not making this up, I found it about a month and a half ago. The portion of Route 6 that extends from the north end of Old Bethel Road to the north end of Benedict Road, okay, right up here, the four-way intersection, that was not put through until 1813. So this road that doesn't get a lot of traffic today, or, nothing in comparison to Route 6 or Interstate 84, that was the main road between Danbury and Hartford. All right, believe it or not, back in 1932, to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Washington's birth, National Geographic magazine produced a Travels of George Washington map showing Washington's route through Connecticut from west to east in 1780. The green star indicates the location of present-day Bethel. So he basically went in this direction and then over to Hartford. So again, to me, it's just amazing to think that George Washington himself came through Bethel back in 1780. Now, here's another big-time figure from the American Revolution, Count Rochambeau. Now, I know I'm going to mangle this French, but Jean-Baptiste Donation de Beaumeur, Comte de Rochambeau, the French general who commanded France's land forces in the United States during the last 3 years of the Revolutionary War, passed through Bethel on June 30th, 1781, while traveling with his army from Rhode Island to New York to meet with Washington. His forces passed through again on October 24th, 1782, en route to their ships in Boston following the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia. The force numbered approximately 4,700 soldiers. Interstate 84's Rochambeau Bridge across the Housatonic River, I'm sure many of us have driven across that bridge multiple times in our life, that commemorates the route that he took. Now, some people are Francophiles. Some people don't have warm feelings for France. But I think anybody who has studied the American Revolution knows we would not have won that war without the help of the French. I mean, they helped us so much. It was incredible. And Rochambeau was one of the leading figures. When you study how we won that last great battle, the Battle of Yorktown, if the French hadn't been there, they helped us both on land and sea. We had really no navy to speak of. Their help was essential for our victory in the war.
Weren't they inspired to help us after the French area?
Well, yes, they had been a traditional enemy of England, but they really didn't think we had a shot. These 13 little colonies are going to defeat the British Empire, and they weren't willing to commit themselves. And they basically said, if you guys over in America can win one big battle, prove to us that you really have what it takes to fight, we'll think about helping you. And when we won the Battle of Saratoga, they said, that's it. All right, now we're in. And they committed themselves to helping us. All right, I talked about a Bethelite who wrote a journal talking about his experiences in the American Revolution, even though he was very, very young. The man's name was Benjamin Hoyt. He lived on Old Holyville Road. He saw the French march through Bethel. This is an excellent painting showing Rochambeau's army on the route that they took from originally from Rhode Island down to Virginia, and then on the return trip they left via Boston. But that's what they would have looked like as they passed through Bethel. And this gentleman, Benjamin Hoyt, saw them go by. And he says, we got to stand at a chamber window. A chamber was a second floor bedroom. We got to stand at a chamber window in the house where Almond Weed now lives, and had a good view of them when they went by. Now, this is the route that the French took. They took the same road that Washington took, only they didn't take that left up Wisconsin Hill, Route 25 from Brookfield. They kept right on going to the center of Newtown. And this is a modern day map, but I'm trying to give you the overall picture. Bailey's History of Danbury, which was written in 1896, states that when the war ended and the French army was on its return from the south to the north, it passed through Danbury, which was then on the line of a great thoroughfare. And the great thoroughfare is that middle road that I explained to you earlier. But that gives you an idea of where the French went. Now, to be more specific, this is a 1965 aerial photograph that shows the route taken by the French. Up at the top, got to go back. Up at the top, if you're familiar where the Stony Hill baseball fields are, just south of that, up until 1968, was the house owned by the Weed family. One of their ancestors was Almond Weed. He owned the house at the time the French came through. Now, there are no trees. Right, this is 1965, which unfortunately some of us can still remember. In comparison to the number of trees that are growing in Stony Hill, even with all the development, there are a lot more than there were in this photograph. And this is where young Benjamin Hoyt is standing up here in the second floor of this house, and he gets almost a panoramic view of the French as they come through. The house remained in the Weed family for generations, but it was eventually sold and then burned as a training exercise for the Stony Hill Fire Department in 1968. Now, if you want to see what it looked like, I know these are some old blurry newspaper photos from 1967, but this is the Almond Weed house. This is from the front. Ooh, I keep hitting the wrong button. This is from the front. This is from the side. So young Benjamin Hoyt would have been looking out the side window of the house and watching the French troops go by. So he saw history in the making and lived long enough to tell about it. And luckily someone found his journal hidden in the floorboards of a house in Danbury that was just about to be torn down, and rescued it. And it was reprinted in 1977 by the Danbury Museum.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. They owned a big chunk, like where the Big Y shopping center is, where the old 4-H fairgrounds were, the agricultural center. That was all the property of the Weed family. All right, this is something I just found out within the last couple of months. So I put up here breaking news, right? Even though it happened in 1782. This was a source I had not read before. It's called the Revolutionary Journal of Baron von Closen. He was an aide-de-camp to Rochambeau. And look at what he says. He says, on the 24th, we marched to Newtown by some better roads than those of the day before. The troops took the road to the left, known to be the best, but we took the shortest. The position of our camp at Newtown was the same as the last year. The Grenadiers and Chasseurs also occupied their former camps. Now, here is McCower Park. This is Payne Road. This is Shelter Rock Road. This is that discontinued portion of Old Turnpike Road. This is all gone, but this portion of the road still exists. This is the steep portion of Walnut Hill Road leading up into the Chimney Heights area. Everybody know where we are now?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what he's trying to say is they got to this point, the whole French contingent, and it was tough going. First of all, they're going up this tremendously steep incline. They are carting along with them all of their baggage and possessions and the artillery, and they're moving at a snail's pace. Well, the officers say, man, we're hungry. We want to have lunch. We want to get to Newtown as fast as we can. So they let the vast body of troops go this way. They went south until they reached Taylor Road, and they cut over on Taylor Road to Plum Trees Road. And Plum Trees Road is a straight shot to the flagpole in the center of Newtown. And their main camp was just down the hill from that on Churchill Road. So even though, he says we took the shorter route, I measured it 6 ways from Sunday, and they're basically the same length. But by going this way, they weren't going to be stuck behind the wagons and the baggage and the artillery, and they're just on horseback and they could move much faster. But that was something pretty much nobody knew, because when they say, oh, they went to the left, we went to the right, nobody knows what that means. But because of a nerd like me who reads all this stuff all the time, I said, I know where they were. And I mapped it out for you. So that made my day when I found this. All right, now we're going to talk about some local heroes, people from Bethel who took a stand. Now, Bethel has its own Paul Revere. Just bear with me for a minute. I'll give you the background. Bailey's History of Danbury, published in 1896, contains an interesting footnote regarding an incident that took place as the British troops approached Bethel. The story was related by one of Danbury's first female physicians. This is what it says in Bailey's History. Dr. Adelaide Holton, a lineal descendant of Thomas Taylor, one of the first settlers, has heard her grandmother tell of seeing the approach of the British as she was returning on horseback over Hoyt's Hill from a visit to a neighbor. She described the gleam of the scarlet uniforms and the flash of arms, and said that she dashed on toward Bethel shouting, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Now, that's all that Bailey says in the History of Danbury. It doesn't identify who the heck she is. It just says she's somehow related to Dr. Adelaide Holton, and she's a lineal descendant of Thomas Taylor. So I said, no, that's not good enough for me. I need to find out who she was. And this is who she was. She was Eunice Seeley Taylor. Genealogy records revealed that the maternal grandmother of Dr. Adelaide Holton, mentioned in that footnote, was Eunice Seeley. She was the daughter of Lieutenant James Seeley and Hannah Bennett Seeley. Now, some people might say, oh, you spelled Seeley wrong, because the Seeley spelled their name Y-E, not E-Y. Some of them did. They couldn't agree on the proper spelling. So some of them spelled it E-Y, some of them spelled it Y-E. Eunice would have been just 18 years of age at the time of the Danbury raid. She later married Sergeant Joshua Taylor, who served in the Revolution. The couple lived at what is now 143 Codfish Hill Road. Their house, unfortunately, is long gone, but that's the address where the house once stood. She raised 9 children and lived to be 90 years of age. Her final resting place can be found in the old burying ground next to the Congregational Church on Main Street. So I'm glad we've been able to identify Eunice Seeley Taylor, and she gets the credit that she deserves. Yes, you're right, compared to some of those stones. All right, here is an entire family that I think should be remembered as heroes. Jesse Peck and his 2 sons, Nathaniel Peck and Eliphalet Peck. All right, here's their story. Bethel resident Jesse Peck, along with his 2 sons, Nathaniel and Eliphalet, was captured during the Battle of Fort Washington, which took place outside New York City on November 16th, 1776. This fort was located just a few blocks north of the eastern end of today's George Washington Bridge. After their capture, they were confined on a British prison ship called the Whitby, which was anchored in the East River off the northeast shore of Brooklyn, New York. During their time on the ship, all 3 contracted smallpox. But fortunately, they were released during a prisoner exchange. On their journey home to Sunset Hill Road in the Wolf Pits district, Eliphalet suffered from frostbite due to the cold weather, which left him temporarily crippled. But it doesn't end there. This illustration depicts the type of British prison ship where Bethel soldier Jesse Peck and his 2 sons were imprisoned. After contracting smallpox, they were released and discharged from the American Army. In other words, first they had to be released from the prison ship, but then they were released to the American Army. The Americans said, hey, you guys have smallpox. We don't need your help anymore. You can go home. All right. And it's interesting, they were released on Christmas Day, 1776. That was the very same day that George Washington crossed the Delaware. Tragically, Jesse passed away a month later on January 28th, 1777, followed by his son Nathaniel, who died just 4 days afterward on February 1st, 1777. Eliphalet Peck, that was the son who suffered from frostbite, survived his ordeal and returned to military service in 1781. He lived until 1842, passing away at the age of 84. Now, can you imagine that? You're fighting for the American cause. You're captured. You're imprisoned. You come down with smallpox. You're released, and you think, okay, Better times are coming. Then they tell you, yeah, but now you have to walk from New York back to Sunset Hill Road in Bethel with smallpox during the coldest time of the year, probably walking through snow. And then the father and one of his sons die. So again, I think that these individuals should definitely be remembered as heroes. Here's another person who should be remembered as a hero. His name was Captain Thomas Starr. He lived in Grassy Plain, and here are two separate accounts of what he did on the day the British invaded Danbury. And here they are. When the British burned Danbury, April 27th, 1777, he was one of the citizen soldiers who rallied to the defense of the town and was struck down by a British officer with his cutlass, making a terrible wound across the head, taking the scalp and part of the face, and left for dead at the foot of Liberty Street. He was taken up by his friends and tenderly cared for, but never entirely recovered from the effects of the wound, and carried the frightful scar to his grave. He received a pension as an invalid captain until his death, April 27th, 1807. And notice the irony. April 27th was the same day he had received the wound back in 1777. He died at the age of 86, and with his wife is buried in the old churchyard in Bethel, meaning the Congregational Church Cemetery. Here's a separate account from a different source. A man named Starr, who also fired at the troopers, was pursued, overtaken, cut about the head and arms, and left on the ground. He was not, however, wounded mortally. Having fallen upon his face, he took the precaution to lie still, and his pursuers, supposing him dead, retired, upon which he crawled away, recovered, and lived afterwards to a good old age. Now, this Thomas Starr lived in a house that once stood near present-day 30 Grassy Plain Street. If you're wondering where it is, he basically lived across the street from the Dunkin' Donuts on Grassy Plain Street. But again, he was a gutsy guy. All right, here's one of my favorites. This guy was a character. Luther Holcomb. Luther Holcomb lived at the western foot of Hoyt's Hill. On April 26, 1777, as the British attack force sent to destroy American supplies in Danbury was approaching from the eastern side of the hill, Holcomb reportedly rode to its crest, waved his sword, and shouted, "Halt the whole universe! Wheel into kingdoms!" The British troops interrupted their march and sent advanced scouts to determine the size of the force opposing them. As the British scouts reached the summit of Hoyt's Hill, they could see Holcomb, all alone, riding at tremendous speed towards the direction of Danbury. So he had been leading an imaginary force. Holcomb may have wanted to slow the advance of the British while having some fun at their expense. Now, some people doubt this story. I tracked this guy down. He's buried in New York State in a small little town called North Afton. When he got older, he applied for a military pension. He had not been a soldier in the war, but he was what was called an artificer. He was a workman. He made wagons. And if you had been employed by the American military during the war, not as a soldier, but as a workman, you too could receive a pension, but he didn't have any paperwork. And so he never received a pension, and his wife, as his widow, never received a pension. And when you read the documents, they sent letter after letter trying to support his claim to the U.S. Pension Office. And one of them is really funny. A guy who was a friend of his said, "I know Luther Holcomb. He definitely was an artificer. I worked with him in Danbury making wagons. In fact, at one point, housing was so short, he and I slept in the same bed." The government still didn't believe him. And poor Luther never got his pension, but he certainly was a character. All right, now here's something a lot of people don't know. In the struggle for independence, even non-combatants paid a price. In the spring of 1775, just as the war was beginning, there was an outbreak of what was then called camp distemper. a disease that was thought to have originated in military encampments. Likely a form of dysentery, it caused high fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, and severe diarrhea. 82 deaths resulted in Danbury. In Bethel, another 48 deaths were attributed to the disease, with most of them being young children. Their graves, marked by crudely carved stones, can be found in the southwest corner of the old burying ground on Main Street. Many soldiers who went off to war, fearing that they would never see their loved ones again, returned safely home, only to find that Camp Distemper had claimed the lives of those they left behind. So it's a very sad corner of the old Congregational Cemetery on Main Street. All right, this is something you don't hear about too often. The other side of the coin, the people who chose to support the British rather than the American fight for independence. And I call this loyalists in our midst. It's a reminder that the struggle for independence was not just a revolution, it was also a civil war. And again, that's an idea that's gaining more and more acceptance. In other words, for a long time, if you had an ancestor who was a loyalist, you kept that quiet. You didn't tell anybody. That was downplayed, and the impression was made, no, everybody wanted independence. Everybody was a patriot. That is not the case. And this battle between Americans was very bitter at times. All right, now, Bethel's loyalists. Bethel was home to a significant number of loyalists, also known as Tories, during the American Revolution. Their resistance to independence was often based more on religious beliefs than on political ones. Many of these loyalists were followers of the Scottish minister Robert Sandeman, who preached in Danbury from 1764 until he died in 1771. His followers became known as Sandemanians, and they believed that higher authorities were ordained by God, which led them to refuse to take up arms against the British king. So in searching for what to do in the Bible, they basically said, well, if King George III is the king of Great Britain, that's the way God wants it. Who are we to argue with God? And they didn't fight for the British in most cases, but they wouldn't fight for the Americans either. And that brought down the hatred of both sides. Both the Americans and the British basically said, hey, if you're not with us, then you're against us. And they were highly persecuted. As a result of their loyalty, some Sandemanians were forced to flee to British-held Long Island, and their homes and property were confiscated by the state of Connecticut. These confiscated estates were subsequently sold to settle debts and to help finance the war. After the conflict, some individuals were able to reclaim their properties, while others chose not to return. Now, here's a Bethel example. Isaac Hoyt Sr. The properties of Isaac Hoyt Sr. and his sons, Benijah Hoyt and Isaac Hoyt Jr., were subject to confiscation after they left with the British forces on April 27, 1771. Here's what you got to understand. If you were a loyalist in this area, at the time the British burned Danbury, you started to sweat because you said, we were having a hard time before. The Americans were all giving us grief for not supporting the movement for independence. But now that the British have been here and have burned the town, they're going to really stick it to us. We need to leave town as quickly as possible. And a lot of them left with the British military because they said, at least this way we'll have some protection. They'll take us back to Long Island. They'll take us back to New York, and we'll be safe. Now, when Isaac and his sons left, Mrs. Hoyt, Isaac's wife, was left behind. And they were going to take away her house because they said, hey, sorry, your husband's a loyalist. But she successfully petitioned the Connecticut General Assembly in May 1777 to be allowed to remain in her house after her husband had fled. The family lived on what was then called the Lane, but is now Blackman Avenue, in what was then known as Town Place in Bethel. That was considered to be the part where Bethel really had its start, it moved when the church was built on Main Street. But prior to the building of that church in 1760, if you ask people, hey, where's the center of Bethel? They would have told you Blackman Avenue and South Street, that area in there. You can see this, I apologize. I try to disguise the fact that I'm a nerd, but there's no disguising it. It took me over 20 years to figure out where Isaac Hoyt lived. And I had to do that by going back to the old land records over in Danbury that date to the 1700s. And I tracked down, he lived at the corner of Blackman Avenue and Greenwood Avenue. His son Benijah lived right where Elizabeth Street branches off from Blackman Avenue. He lived directly across the street from that old Captain Daniel Hickok house, the one that burned. And his other son, Isaac Hoyt, his house stood exactly where the entrance to Vanderbilt Chemical Company is today on Taylor Avenue. So Isaac and Mary Hoyt were among the 70 original parishioners of Bethel's Congregational Church established in 1759. In the 1760s, Isaac converted to Sandemanianism and refused to take up arms against the king. Aware that his life could be at risk after the British burned Danbury, he left with the returning British troops and sought safety on Long Island. He and his sons later relocated to Canada for a short time, but returned to Bethel even before the war officially ended. A lot of the loyalists from our area did something very similar. Some of them would go to Long Island or New York City, but when the war ends and the British are kicked out of New York City, the vast majority of them sail up to Nova Scotia and take up residency in Canada. Now, a lot of the people from our area, they tried it, but they said, this is terrible. We just went back 100 years in time. In other words, Danbury, by the end of the Revolution, had been established for 99 years. All right, it had almost been in existence for 100 years. That was 100 years of progress, of clearing the land, of planting crops, of establishing, what they saw as civilization. When they went to Nova Scotia, they were back to square one, all right, where they had to begin clearing the land. And a lot of them said, no, we don't want to do that. We were better off in America. And what's remarkable to me is in most cases, when they came back home, they were accepted. The persecution, not entirely, but pretty much ended once the war ended. It was kind of a forgive and forget and let's start over type of situation. Now, here's another Sandemanian loyalist who was persecuted. His name was Hezekiah Benedict, and he lived up in the Stony Hill section of Bethel. Shortly after the burning of Danbury, he and his son were attacked while plowing a field on their farm. The son received a severe gunshot wound in his thigh, inflicted by an enraged resident seeking revenge on anyone considered to be sympathetic to the enemy. The Benedicts fled to Long Island for safety, and portions of their property were confiscated by the state of Connecticut. Both would later return when the war was ending and the tempers had cooled. And again, they lived on the corner of Hawleyville and Old Hawleyville Road, up in that section. The Benedict family, in the early days of Stony Hill, they were pretty much it. They owned the vast majority of land in Stony Hill.
We have any idea of percentage of Bethel and the Danbury residents at the time of the war who were loyalists?
They kind of mirror the overall picture throughout the 13 colonies, and estimates vary, but it was basically between 15 and 30%.
Because in Richfield, they claim roughly 50.
Yes. Here's the tough situation that Bethel was in. Again, Bethel was still part of Danbury during the Revolution. Reading, our next door neighbor, had a high loyalist population. Newtown, our neighbor, had a high loyalist population, and Ridgefield only a short distance away. And so the influence of the communities that surrounded us was very strong. But again, the estimate is somewhere between 15 on the low end and 30% on the high end. All right. last section here, freedom isn't free, lest we forget. And this is my closing thought. Throughout the course of the war, an estimated 6,800 Americans were killed in action. 6,100 were wounded, and upwards of 20,000 were taken prisoner. Historians believe that at least an additional 17,000 deaths were the result of disease, including 8,000 to 12,000 who died while prisoners of war. When you were made a prisoner of war during the Revolution, that was basically a death sentence. Those Pecks who were able to leave, they left, but as you saw, 2 of the 3 died shortly thereafter. We sometimes forget the tremendous debt of gratitude we owe to those who risked everything to ensure that we might enjoy the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this might sound corny, but I feel that after you become familiar with these types of individuals and what they did in order to bring about American independence, and I got to make sure I don't get too emotional, the next time you have to say the Pledge of Allegiance, or the next time you have to sing the national anthem, it means a little bit more than it did before. And I will end there. And thank you. Thank you for coming on. Does anybody have any quick questions? Because again, we don't want to hold people. Go ahead. He was, okay, he had started his trip way down in Morristown, New Jersey, where he had his winter encampment. And the French had just arrived to America. They had landed in Providence, Rhode Island, but they came as far west as Hartford. And Washington said, you know, I don't want you folks, you just had that long trip across the Atlantic. You wait in Hartford, I'll meet you there. And so he rode his horse with his aides all the way from Morristown, New Jersey, up to Hartford, Connecticut, and back again. There is a group, and they have a website, and I don't remember what their official name is, but basically their idea is tracking George Washington's actions and movements every day of the American Revolution. And it's called, I think it might be just called Washington Day by Day. They have not yet gotten up to September 20th, 1780. They're in the process of putting the whole calendar together, but I'm waiting to see, I'm hoping that their information will confirm the fact that other evidence suggests that he did pass through Bethel on that date. Any other questions? Yes.
What do you think people did when the British were marching to Danbury? Was everyone just hidden in their houses looking out windows?
Most people got the heck out of town as fast as they could. Yes. Excellent question. Again, in the research I did in preparation for this, I found out that the people of Danbury learned at 3 a.m. in the morning before the British arrived that they were on their way. So I think people just, started going crazy and said, all right, we're going to load up our wagon with every type of valuable we have. If we don't have enough time to do that, we're going to bury our silverware. We're going to hide whatever we have. And a lot of them went straight north to New Milford to wait it out. Because what happened afterwards is if you were on the streets, if you were a Danburian and you were on the streets when the British were in town and you weren't posing any opposition, then you were considered to be in collusion with the British, and you did not want that to happen to you. There was a man whose house was used by the British. The British officers, including Tryon, stayed in a house on Triangle Street, and it was owned by an old gentleman by the name of Nehemiah Dibble. And after the British had left, the Danburians, who were patriots, said, we're gonna teach old Dibble a lesson. And they brought him to a pond and they erected what they used to call a ducking stool. It's kind of like a seesaw like this, and they put old Nehemiah Dibble on the end of the seesaw, and they dunked him in the water and held him under long enough till he was just about to drown, and then they popped him back up again, let him catch his breath, and did it again. But they were trying to say, hey, what you did was wrong, playing host to the British. We want you to be on our side.
So you think that people of Bethel, when the British were marching to Danbury, they would have been left their homes by then?
The vast majority. Along the route primarily. In other words, they knew the most likely route the British troops would take. So if you were up in Stony Hill, you were not as worried. But if you lived in downtown, but what the British did, and they weren't supposed to do this, the officers told the men, we don't want any plundering, all right? You guys behave yourselves. We don't want you stealing chickens and sheep and cows and horses. Well, the British soldiers didn't listen very carefully. And that's exactly what they did, because after the raid, people who suffered losses were able to report them to Connecticut's government and say, I want to be compensated for this amount. And in Bethel, there were quite a number of people who put in, a bill, and their houses weren't burned or destroyed, but they had livestock stolen in most cases. So you didn't want to hang around because you would appear to be a target. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Which one? I don't know which one you mean. I have not had a chance to read that. If it's the one by Keith Jones, I know Mr. Jones. I actually had his son as a student at Ridgefield High School, and he does very, very good work. Ridgefield, they take great pride in the fact that the battle, that's the only true battle of the Revolution that took place in Connecticut. And they take great pride in that. And so they've done a lot of good research. Sure.
March from Rhode Island to Yorktown.
Yep. Right.
This is incredible. Yes. And they did it at record time.
Yeah. And there's a whole website devoted to just that. It makes me laugh because a few years back, they created a website and they put a map on their website showing the route that the French had taken. And I'm looking at the map for our area. That's the only part of the route on which I have any knowledge. I said, wait a minute. They have the French troops traveling along Interstate 84. That was put in 1961. I don't think that's correct. And so that's when I started researching that middle road. And I actually contacted the website and showed them all of my research and the maps and the illustration. And they were nice enough to include it on the website. So it's there now and it's corrected, but you'll see maps other places, other websites where they still have them traveling on an interstate highway. Yes, they did. And Ridgefield was a more happening place than it is today. It's kind of a sleepy little neighborhood now, but at that point in time, there was a tavern there, and quite a number of people happened to stop in that area. Yes, sir.
Was the Rhode Bethel part of the Rhode Island to Yorktown? Was that a different, or was that different?
No, you're absolutely right. It was part of his route from Rhode Island to Yorktown, and then after that tremendous victory, it was, and they basically stayed for the most part in the same camps they had used on the way south. And that source that I just found recently, it seemed almost as if the officer was happy to know, hey, we're staying in the same place we stayed last year. It's familiar to us. We know where it is and how to get there. Correct. Now there was no bridge there at the time of the Revolution. There was But, but there were some bridges across rivers as wide as Housatonic. They're very, very fragile by today's standards, but at that point in time, they had a ferry. It's just, again, it's interesting to me to try to imagine yourself back in 1777 and all of these hundreds of troops getting on the ferry, taking one trip across the river, then coming back, and all the equipment, the horses, and doing that time and time again until you have everybody on the other side of the river.
84 mostly forest at that time.
It was probably cleared because it's hard for us to grasp this today, but trees in this time period were seen as fuel. You might save a few trees around your house that were ornamentation, they are known as ornamental trees. But everything else, it's like leaving a can of gasoline out in your backyard. You'd say, that's a waste. I can use that. I can put that in my car. They looked at trees as what was going to keep them warm and to cook their food. So like Hoyt's Hill, if you see photographs of Hoyt's Hill from as late as, as recently as the late 1800s, early 1900s, the whole hill was bald. There was hardly a tree there. It was all farmers' fields. And that way, it was productive. The trees, as the people saw it then, the trees didn't produce anything. A farmer's field would produce an income. So again, our idea of the value of trees has changed dramatically.
This time we're talking this period in Bethel and Danbury, were there a fair number of taverns?
Yes. Bethel did not yet have a tavern in 1777. Danbury had several. And there was one, just like in that illustration I showed you, that had the image of King George III on its tavern sign. And they had to quickly take that down once the revolution started. But yes, and taverns would fill up very quickly. I mean, today we're used to staying in motels and hotels that can accommodate hundreds of people. The taverns at the time, if you had 10 people staying at your tavern, you had a full house. And people, it sounds crazy to us today, they shared beds. You might have 3 different customers sleeping in the same bed because that was all there was, and people accepted it. Yes, sir.
The old Pickers and Barnelli Fire.
Yes. Yes. The Hickok Tavern. But from what I have seen, Benjamin Hickok, Major Benjamin Hickok, who was the brother of the Daniel Hickok, whose house used to be on Blackman Avenue. That was a tavern, but that was not a tavern until after the Revolution. That had been his father's house. And when his father died, he inherited it. And then it seems he did some major renovation. Benjamin Hickok became very wealthy, and he had a military career, which then he kind of parlayed into a business career, and he owned a number of buildings and a great deal of property. But yes, that did become a tavern, but it was after the Revolution. Any other questions?
You know how long Hickok Road has been there?
Hickok Road. That's a relatively, in the whole scheme of things, it's a relatively new road. It's not one of the original roads. And at first it was called Florida Avenue. The Hickok family, the wealthier members of the family used to go to Florida for the winter. They would take the train down and back, and they called it Florida Avenue. And it seemed like after they died, people said, well, we remember because the Hickoks owned it. Let's switch it to Hickok Avenue. The story that's been told, and I don't have any documentation about this, that somebody won a lottery that had been held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, that road was specifically created for one residence on Milwaukee Avenue, number 51 Milwaukee Avenue, which is at the corner of K-View and Milwaukee Avenue. That was the home of the Reverend John Eli, the second congregational minister, and that road was put through so that he could get from his house to the Congregational Church. And then, you know, people say, oh, well, what if he wants to go the other way? We better extend it in the other direction too. And they brought it up to today's Greenwood Avenue.
Right at the house.
Yes, that house must have shook when the Chippewa went by. Yes,
Yeah, just a general Bethel history.
sure, sure.
I read your books. I really enjoyed the Bethel history. I was curious because there were so many, you were a hatting town, like all the
Mhm.
factors. Obviously, there was mercury poisoning and Mad Hatter's disease. I read
Yes.
that you can call them the Danbury Shakes
Right.
because of the hat factory.
You're absolutely right.
Was there, what might that have been like in Bethel to have a whole population of people who were getting tremors and sort of that?
Well, you know, some people say the danger is still with us because so much of the runoff produced by the hat factories. In other words, I remember reading that I think it took 70 gallons of water to produce one hat. And when they were through using that water, they used it basically to shrink the fur, either rabbit fur or beaver fur that was being used to make the hat. They would heat it up in hot water and they would shrink it until it kind of interlocked and started to form felt. What they didn't use was dumped in the river. So in other words, you know, mercury doesn't really break down. It sinks to the bottom of the riverbed. And so, you know, I don't want to start a big controversy, but there still could be some mercury. But my family worked in the hatting industry. They lived over in Danbury and they worked for the Lee Hat Factory. None of them came down with that Hatter shake, but that was for the people who worked in one particular part of the hat making process. So they were more susceptible. And you know, what's sad is a lot of these people, I think they didn't have Social Security, they didn't have Medicare or Medicaid. They just had to retire when they could no longer function at their place of work, and they were taken in by their relatives. So it was pretty tough, and those were hazardous places. The other thing that would happen is people would breathe in the fibers of the animal fur that they were working with, which could give them respiratory problems. Any other? No OSHA. All right, then we will stop there, and I thank you all for coming.